An 18-year-old walked into a car dealership with his own money, ready to buy his first car. They kicked him out without a second thought. The next day, his billionaire mother showed up and made sure they never forgot his name. Omari Thorne had his entire day planned out. It was a Thursday, late morning, and the air in Smyrna, Tennessee, carried that sticky weight just before a summer storm. Omari didn't mind. He had on his grey windbreaker, black cargo pants, and a pair of old white Nikes that had seen better days. Tucked under his arm was a blue plastic folder with 5 printed listings. Used hybrids, all under $15,000, all with decent mileage. He wasn't here to impress anyone, just to prepare for his new life. Omari had just graduated from a magnet high school in Murfreesboro and had been accepted into Georgia Tech's engineering program. Early decision. He wanted a reliable car to make the long drives back and forth from campus. Nothing fancy. Just something that wouldn't break down on I-24. So when he stepped through the glass doors of Crestview Motors, a small but shiny dealership just off the highway, his energy was calm, focused. He even paused to hold the door open for a woman walking out. She smiled at him. The receptionist behind the front desk didn't. "Can I help you?" she asked, without looking up from her screen. "Yeah, I'm here to look at a few of the hybrids you've got listed," Omari replied, lifting the folder slightly. "I printed them out. There's a couple of Sonatas and a Civic I saw online." The woman gave a short blink, then said, "Are you here with your parents?" "No, Mom. I'm buying it myself." She gave him a tight smile and waved toward the lot. "Someone will be out shortly." But no one came. Omari waited by the sliding glass doors, glancing outside. He could see the cars, lined up clean and polished. The Civic was there. He checked again. Same VIN as the listing. He took a step outside toward it, then stopped when a tall man in slacks and a red Crestview polo shirt walked up, cutting him off. "You lost?" the man asked. He had a clipboard in hand but didn't look at it. His eyes were fixed on Omari's clothes, his shoes. "No, I'm here for a car," Omari said again, holding out the folder. The salesman didn't even glance at it. "Well, this isn't a place to hang around if you're not serious. We've had incidents lately." "Incidents?" Omari repeated, confused. "People coming around, checking out cars they can't afford, taking photos, causing issues. You understand?" Omari felt something start to twist in his stomach, but he kept his voice steady. "I printed out a few models from your site. I'm not taking photos. I just want to test drive one." The man gave a forced chuckle. "Why don't you come back with a parent or someone who can talk financing?" "I don't need a parent. I'm paying. Cash. My name is on the account," Omari said. "I've already talked to my bank about it." "Look," the man said, backing up a step. "I'm not trying to be rude, all right? It's just, people get ideas. And right now, I don't have time for that." Omari didn't move. He just stared at the man. His folder was still in his hands, now damp with sweat. "So you want me to leave?" "I'm saying we're busy today. You can come back another time. Or better yet, maybe try one of the used lots down the road. They might have something more in your range." There it was. Omari didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just looked down at his folder, then back at the Civic across the lot, and gave the faintest nod, not of agreement, but of understanding. He turned around, walked back to his car, and drove away. But what the staff at Crestview Motors didn't know was who Omari Thorne really was. Omari didn't play music on the way home, just silence and the soft grind of his wipers as a drizzle began to streak across his windshield. He wasn't the kind of kid to rant or throw things. He processed things quietly, sometimes too quietly for his own good. He took the long way home, past the old park where he used to race his bike with his cousin Elijah, past the tiny library that still had posters from last summer's reading challenge taped to the window. Familiar streets, familiar stillness. But this time, he felt different. Like the pavement underneath his tires wasn't as solid as it used to be. When he pulled into his driveway, he just sat there for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, staring out through the rain-speckled glass. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and black coffee. His mom had always said those were the 2 cents that made her feel like the day was hers. Omari slipped off his shoes at the door, still not saying a word. He walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured himself a glass of water. Dr. Ayanna Thorne was upstairs on a conference call. Omari could hear the rhythm of her voice from her home office. Cool, measured, confident. She was the kind of woman who could speak in front of the CDC board one day and patch up her son's scraped knee the next. When she came downstairs later that evening, she found him in the living room, sitting on the couch, laptop open, his folder by his side. "Find anything you liked?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "I went to Crestview. They had some decent stuff." She sat down across from him. "You test drive anything?" "No." Ayanna tilted her head slightly. "Why not?" "They told me to come back with a parent. Said I looked like I was just hanging around." He said it casually, as if reading off a grocery list. Ayanna's lips pressed together. Not anger, just a pause. A precise pause. "Did something happen?" He shook his head. "It's whatever. I wasn't going to start anything there. I left." She watched him carefully. "Did they say something specific?" "Not really. Just kind of treated me like I didn't belong." Ayanna didn't say much after that. She simply leaned forward, rested her hand on his knee for a second, then got up and started putting away dishes from the sink. But her mind was somewhere else. Omari returned to his laptop. He kept scrolling through listings. His bank account was still open in another tab. He had enough. He knew that. And yet, he'd never felt smaller. He didn't know it, but upstairs in her office, Ayanna was already making plans. She wasn't the type to storm into buildings or cause scenes. That wasn't her style. She believed in moving with control. Sharp, deliberate control. If you made her speak up, it was because she absolutely had to. And when she did, people listened. That night, she made one call to a friend who worked in property insurance and had done consulting work for Crestview Motors. Nothing heavy, just a question or two about their owner, their staff structure, who managed customer interactions. By morning, she had everything she needed. Omari was still asleep when she backed the Rolls-Royce out of the garage. She rarely drove it. It was more symbolic than practical. A gift from a French pharmaceutical investor she'd worked with years ago. Ayanna had almost sold it once, until her mother convinced her to keep it. "Sometimes people need to see what success looks like," her mother had said. "Especially the ones who think they already know." As the car pulled onto the main road, the silver accents caught the morning light like quiet armor. But this wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up. It was barely 9:30 a.m. when the double doors at Crestview Motors whooshed open again. Same lobby. Same woman behind the front desk, typing away at her keyboard, distracted by the glow of her screen. But this time it wasn't Omari. The first thing that caught her attention was the car. The kind you don't forget. Midnight blue paint so polished it looked like a mirror. Rolls-Royce Dawn, custom interior, Georgia plates. The kind of car you don't usually see parked outside a mid-range dealership in Smyrna, Tennessee. The second thing she noticed was the woman stepping out. Dr. Ayanna Thorne didn't need to say a word to command attention. She walked in wearing a navy suit, heels that didn't make a sound, and no jewelry except a silver watch. No smile. No anger either. Just presence. The kind that makes people stand up a little straighter without knowing why. "Good morning," Ayanna said. The receptionist blinked. "Good morning. Are you here for a service appointment?" "No," she said, setting her bag gently on the front counter. "I'd like to speak with the manager." "Sure. One moment." The receptionist picked up the phone, dialing fast, her eyes flicking to the car outside. In less than a minute, a man appeared. Mid-40s, tucked-in dress shirt, Bluetooth in one ear. He looked like he was always just finishing a phone call. "I'm Dan Grissom, general manager here," he said, extending his hand. "What can I help you with today?" Ayanna didn't take the handshake. "You had an interaction with my son yesterday. 18 years old. Black, quiet, wore a windbreaker, brought printouts of several used vehicles. You told him to leave." Dan's face twitched, but he held his professional smile. "Mama, I meet a lot of people. It's possible there was some misunderstanding. Ayana opened her bag, pulled out Omari's blue folder, and placed it flat on the counter. He walked in with this. He showed your staff exactly which models he came for. He had financing pre-approved and was prepared to pay cash. He left without a test drive. Know why? Dan's smile thinned. There's no need to make this confrontational. It's not, Ayana replied evenly. It's informational. Dan exhaled. Look, if he felt disrespected, I'm happy to offer him a second visit. Maybe I can walk him through inventory myself. That won't be necessary. Dan looked confused. Then how can I make this right? Ayana picked up the folder, opened it, and held up one of the listings. You see this Civic here? Your staff told him it was out of his range. You assumed he didn't belong. You didn't know who he was. But that's not the problem. She flipped the paper down gently. The problem is that even if he was just a kid with a dream and not a bank account, he still deserved respect. Dan shifted slightly, finally breaking eye contact. Ayana reached into her bag again and pulled out a single business card. It was matte black, embossed with her name in silver. Dr. Ayana Thorne, CEO, Oratech Biolabs. Next time a young man walks in with that kind of preparation, I suggest you ask about his name before you assume his value, she said. You never know who you're turning away. For a second, the room held still. The receptionist stopped typing. Another salesman paused at the door to the lot. Ayana looked Dan in the eye. And just so you know, I didn't come here because my son asked me to. He didn't even want me to. He told me not to make it a big deal, but that's the difference between him and me. He gives grace. I give reminders. Dan swallowed hard. Ayana adjusted her bag on her shoulder and turned toward the exit. Oh, and the car outside? She said over her shoulder. Not for sale, just a visual aid. She walked out without waiting for a reply. But the conversation inside wasn't over. Not for Dan. Not for anyone who'd seen her come in. Dan didn't move for a full 30 seconds after the door closed. His ears burned, not from embarrassment, but from realization. He wasn't new to the job. He'd been in the business long enough to know when someone came in looking for a scene, and when someone came in with truth. And Dr. Thorne had brought the second one. Behind him, the receptionist whispered, "Was that her son yesterday?" The kid Dan didn't answer. In his office, he sat down, clicked his pen a few times, and stared at his desk. Then he called in the salesman who had turned Omari away. The same guy with the red Crestview polo. "Chris, close the door." Chris looked uneasy. "What's up? You remember that kid from yesterday? Black teenager. Said he wanted to look at hybrids?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, the one hanging around the Civic?" Dan folded his hands. He wasn't hanging around. He had paperwork, printed listings, pre-approved. His mother came in this morning. Chris scoffed lightly. "Okay, but I mean, he looked like—" Dan cut him off. "He looked like what?" Chris paused, mouth slightly open, but no words came. Dan leaned back. "You ever thought maybe we don't get a lot of black customers in here because they walk in, see how we look at them, and walk right back out?" Chris squirmed in his seat. "It's not like that." "You sure?" Dan asked. "Because she didn't yell. She didn't ask for anything free. She just wanted us to know who we turned away. Not because he was poor, but because we assumed he was." Chris stared at the floor. Dan pointed at the window that looked out onto the lot. "Every week we complain about online competition and people wasting our time. But maybe we're wasting our own opportunities by deciding who's worth our effort before they even speak." Chris didn't say anything else. Just stood there, probably thinking back on all the other young men he'd waved off, with the same tired excuses. Meanwhile, back at home, Omari was still in bed, earbuds in, rewatching a video about solar battery conversions. His morning was quiet. He had no idea his mother had already walked back into the very place that shut him out. And he didn't need to. She hadn't gone there for credit. She did it because she'd seen it happen before. Ayana's own memories came back as she drove back home, not from rage, but from something older. From the time she was 24, in a pharmacy lab in Columbus, Ohio, when a supplier assumed she was an intern. Or when she was 30, pitching her first synthetic blood proposal to a room full of men who only made eye contact with her white co-founder. Or when she sat on a panel and someone asked her if she was the marketing rep. It didn't matter how many degrees she had. Some people only saw what they were willing to. She wasn't trying to protect Omari from that. She couldn't. But she could make sure someone remembered the next time they tried it. That afternoon, while Ayana was on another Zoom meeting in her home office, Dan at Crestview Motors sent an internal memo. Nothing dramatic, just a directive that reminded the team of the dealership's values and the importance of treating every person, no matter how they look, with equal professionalism. He knew it wouldn't fix the deeper issue, but it was a start. And he didn't send it because he was scared of a lawsuit or a media post. Ayana hadn't even threatened anything. She didn't have to. She'd simply spoken truth in a way that couldn't be argued with, but the person who'd felt it the most hadn't even been there to hear it. Ayana hadn't always been the woman who could walk into a dealership and make grown men freeze mid-sentence. That kind of composure, that kind of weight, it was built, not born. Forged through pressure, sometimes pain, and always clarity. She remembered standing in line for reduced lunch as a kid in Birmingham. Her mother worked nights cleaning offices. Her father was gone by the time she turned 6. Ayana was the quiet girl who read science books in corners and borrowed anatomy guides from the public library when other kids were sneaking off to smoke behind the gym. People underestimated her, constantly, called her aggressive when she spoke clearly, said she was too serious when she didn't laugh at bad jokes. So she kept her focus on one thing, building something no one could take away. Omari had grown up with a different kind of life, but Ayana made sure he didn't grow up entitled. She'd taught him how to build IKEA furniture by the time he was 11. Had him volunteering at free clinics when most kids were sleeping in on weekends. Not because she wanted him to suffer, but because she wanted him to see the real world, not just the safe bubble she'd created. She also taught him when to speak and when to walk away. That's why she wasn't surprised when he came home the day before, quiet and withdrawn. He had learned how to hold his anger, not because he was weak, but because he was raised to know that sometimes silence echoes louder than rage. What got to her most, though, was how quickly he'd accepted it. Not because he didn't care, but because he was used to it. That thought followed her all day. The idea that her son, with his 3.9 GPA, his early acceptance to one of the best tech schools in the country, and his genuine, calm nature, had already made peace with being treated like a threat. Ayana remembered when he was 10, and a neighbor across the street called to report a strange boy walking through yards. That boy had been Omari, walking home from basketball practice with his gym bag and science fair project under his arm. She remembered the police car pulling up and Omari sitting quietly on the curb, just waiting. Not scared, not confused, just tired, even back then. She never told him this, but that was the night she started looking into security systems. Not to keep people out, but to protect him from being misread. She knew the world wouldn't always offer her son the same grace she had worked for. That's why she taught him how to move like water, adaptable, strong, but calm. That's why he hadn't argued at the dealership. And that's exactly why she had. Later that evening, Omari came downstairs with his backpack and quietly asked, "You still got the list of dealerships you liked better?" Ayana didn't say much, just handed him her phone with a saved note titled, "Better Options." She hadn't deleted it, even after buying the Rolls. He scrolled through and stopped at one. "Think this one would take me seriously?" Ayana paused. "They'd better." Omari smiled faintly, but something shifted in his eyes. He wasn't bitter, just more aware. But what neither of them knew yet was that someone else had been watching their story more closely than expected. The next morning at Crestview Motors felt different. No official meeting was called, no press release, but something in the air had shifted. The sales floor, usually full of forced smiles and chatter, was quieter. Not silent, just thoughtful. Dan, the general manager, had made a decision that morning while shaving, staring at his own reflection. He'd handled it wrong. Not just the boy. The entire culture he'd let sit under his watch for too long, the kind of mindset that treated image as more important than intent. That made assumptions before a single word was spoken. He walked in earlier than usual, in time to catch Chris outside unlocking the Civic. Same one Omari had wanted to test drive. Dan motioned to it. "Detail this one today. I want it ready to go. Tires, battery, everything." Chris gave a half nod. "You think the kid'll come back?" "No," Dan said. "I don't, but it's not about him anymore. It's about what we do next." Meanwhile, Ayana had already moved on. She didn't linger. She didn't post about what happened or call reporters. That wasn't her goal. She hadn't gone there for likes or outrage. She went to remind them, quietly, precisely, that their blind spots had consequences. It was her own mother's voice that came back to her that morning while sipping coffee on the porch. "Some people only see what they want until you show them what they missed." Omari, on the other hand, was already texting with a rep from another dealership across town. One that actually responded when he asked questions online. One that didn't blink when he asked for a cash purchase option. He wasn't in a rush. He knew what he wanted, and he knew what he wouldn't tolerate. Later that day, Ayana got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of her. "Dr. Thorne, this is Dan Grissom from Crestview Motors." She didn't speak right away. "I know you didn't ask for anything," he continued. "But I wanted you to know, we talked to our team. We're adjusting how we handle walk-ins, especially young ones. We're setting up a training module about bias, starting next month. It's not everything, but it's a start." Ayana didn't thank him. Not out of rudeness, just precision. "Make sure it sticks," she said. "I will." A pause. "And tell your son," Dan added. He left more of an impact than he probably knows. After the call, Ayana stood for a moment in the middle of her kitchen, phone in hand. She wasn't the kind of person who needed validation, but something about that conversation settled things. Not just because someone finally admitted they got it wrong, but because they finally wanted to get it right. That evening, Omari came in from the garage, holding a key fob. "Think I'm going with the Sonata," he said. Ayana looked up from her laptop. "From the second place?" He nodded. "Guy there walked me through everything. No weird energy, just facts. Felt different." She smiled. "You like it?" "Yeah. It's not flashy, but it's solid. That's you," she said. He paused, then asked, "Did you say something to them?" She leaned back slightly. "I had a conversation." He raised an eyebrow. "Like a serious one?" "I wasn't there to yell," she said. "Just to remind them who they missed." Omari took that in, then smiled, slow and genuine. "Thanks," Ayana shrugged. "You thanked me by not letting it change how you see yourself." But what they both knew, without having to say it, was that silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. And sometimes the loudest message is delivered in the quietest voice. A week later, the Sonata sat in their driveway, its paint still shining from the final dealer polish. Omari had already taken it on a few drives, nothing long yet, just around town. Back roads, a few parking lot turns to get the feel of it. He liked the way it handled. Quiet, steady, no attention, just performance. He didn't say much about the Crestview experience after that. Not because he'd forgotten, but because it didn't define the outcome. The lesson had already settled into him like water in soil. Absorbed, not evaporated. Ayana noticed it too. In small ways. The way he carried himself when they went out. The way he double-checked his bank app before making a purchase. The way he asked her if he should wear a collared shirt when they visited a different dealership later that month to help his cousin look for a truck. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was simply adjusting, like she had so many times before. They never needed to sit down and have a heart-to-heart. That wasn't their style. Their conversations lived in the in-between, in the glance across the kitchen, in the quiet nod when something difficult was said without being said. One evening, while Omari was helping his cousin practice parallel parking, Ayana sat at her desk going through some grant proposals. Her eyes landed on a photo taped to the corner of her monitor. Omari at age 9, holding up a science fair ribbon, beaming in a shirt 2 sizes too big. Behind him in the photo was the family's old Honda Accord, the one Ayana had driven through med school and most of her early career. It wasn't the ribbon that made her smile. It was the look in his eyes. He'd always carried potential. And now he carried proof. Not of wealth, not of revenge, but of knowing who he was, no matter what anyone else assumed. A few days later, she got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on simple white stationery. We're doing better now, because someone reminded us why we have to. Thank you. Crestview Motors. She folded it carefully and slid it into the back of her planner. Not because she needed to remember them, but because she wanted to remember that sometimes people can change, if they're made to see what they've ignored for too long. That evening, she told Omari about the letter. He just chuckled and said, "Guess they finally figured it out." Ayana looked at him. "You figured it out a long time ago." He gave a small shrug. "Still feels good, though," she laughed. "Yeah, it does." Outside, the sun was slipping behind the houses across the street, casting long shadows across the driveway. Omari stood by the car for a moment, arms crossed, just looking at it. Then he opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. No music, just movement. No one watching but the people who mattered. And in that moment, it was clear. He didn't just get a car. He got something bigger. Self-respect, clarity. The knowledge that quiet dignity speaks louder than noise. That how the world sees you doesn't get to define how you see yourself. That sometimes the best kind of power is walking away without losing your voice. Stories like Omari's happen every day, and not all of them have a Rolls-Royce pulling into the lot. But each one carries a choice, for all of us, to pause, to rethink, to see people fully before deciding who they are. If you felt this story, if it made you reflect or reminded you of someone you know, share it. Let others feel it too. And don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are coming. Stories that speak quietly but clearly.